Ballydesmond, John. And there's another green up there behind it. That's the green over there.
Lads, if you push in a bit closer, Raymond has no amplification system, so we might just say a few words here about Tom Billy Murphy and then take out your fiddles and we'll all play the Ballydesmond polkas. There's a lot of other musicians buried here. It's a dangerous thing to go mentioning them because the only one close to myself is Dan Hurley, who's buried down there, played a lot with Dan. Nora Hurley, I was told as well, who founded the Credit Union, is buried just up there. So a lot of famous people
Jim
here.
Keefe is just
Jim Keefe,
Teahan,
and once again into names, Molly Myers, Din Tarrant, so we get into dangerous territory, which I'm mentioning, because we're going to leave out 7 or 8 more. Yeah. So Raymond's going to say a few words about Tom Billy, and then we'll have your fiddles ready, we'll play a few tunes, right?
Okay. This is the final resting place of a man who travelled all over this country in a donkey, playing music and teaching music, in a career that spanned the 19th and 20th century. He was born in 1875, just maybe a couple of kilometres over the road here, in the townland of Glencollins. He was on the younger side of a very large family, and a true link between the music of a long forgotten time. He was what could I say? I don't want to delay him too much and say too much about him. He had a tough enough life. He was only 8 years old when his mother died. It was a devastating blow for the whole family, but particularly for an 8-year-old child like Tom. But with the resilience that was part of his make-up for the rest of his life, he shouldered his cross and soldiered on, as they say. But misfortune wasn't done with him yet. He was only barely into his teens when he picked up some virus. They think it was probably the polio virus, and it blinded him and practically crippled him as well. It affected his right-hand side. But he was taking music lessons from another travelling music teacher called Teahan and Ossel, who used to also travel around in a donkey. And he was taking lessons from before his mother died, from when he was very young. I suppose Teahan was probably teaching others of his siblings, and it would have been a great consolation and help to him in those dark days of his recovery. Good for the mind, good for his mental health, and also playing the fiddle with the bow would have been good physiotherapy for his impaired right hand side. What else can I say about him? He died in 1943, and none of us knew him, but we know of him. He's, the tales, and he was a great storyteller, and his wit and his quips and his humour is well chronicled and well still told. The Murphys were farmers. There would have been very little employment for a blind person in Ireland at the time. Even yet, it would be quite difficult. And the Murphys were farmers, and Tom could quite easily have stayed at home and been supported by the family, and maybe helped with a few chores around the farm and things like that. But he wasn't that type of man. He wanted a bit of independence. He wanted a life of his own. It wouldn't have been much good. Now, a lot of people, when they're talking about him, mention the blind pension, that he would have had some little bit of support, but he wouldn't really. The blind pension was related to the old age pension at that time. The old age pension was introduced around 1908 or 1909, and in 1920 the Blind Persons Act was passed, and it was the first sort of physically, the first sort of pension for anybody with any kind of a blindness in the world. But it was related to the old age pension, in that any blind person between the ages of 50 and 70 would be entitled to draw the equivalent of the old age pension, which at the time was about 7 and 6. And it wouldn't have been a hell of an awful lot of use to Tom, because he was born in 1875 and he wouldn't have qualified for it until 1925. So that would have been the first 35 years of his working life. He would have been penniless. So music was about the only viable occupation for a blind person in Ireland for hundreds of years. I mean, we can throw our minds back to, say, Turlough O'Callaghan and in the 1600s and the 1700s, 200 years before Tom was born, and Rory Dowlow Teahan. And there were blind pipers. There was no blind man from Clare who was depicted in a famous 19th century lithograph as a gentleman piper, and he was anything but. He died a pauper. And we've all heard of Garrett Barry. We play Garrett Barry's jig. It's very important in speaking about blind people like that and blind music teachers. Garrett Barry taught Gilbert Clancy, and Gilbert Clancy was the father of Willie Clancy of Milltown Malbay fame. So Matt hinted at it there earlier on today at the monument, about the things being handed down from generation to generation. And the blind fiddlers were the same. Staying in Clare, you had, say, the Schooner Breen, who taught Mrs. Crotty's mother, and Paddy McNamara taught Paddy Kenny's father, who would have taught Paddy. And one of Paddy's first pupils when he started teaching was P.J. Hayes, the father of celebrated fiddler Martin Hayes, and Paddy Kenny was also his uncle. So you see the importance of those old blind travelling music teachers can't be overstressed. Really, like their influence stretched way further into the future than their little classes in candlelit country cottages. And really, as I say, their importance can't be. And Tom Billy has a place in that roll of honour as well. He travelled far and wide here on a donkey, making a living from teaching children how to play. And when he'd stay in a house, they'd hold a house dance, and Tom would get the proceeds of the house dance. He had got a certain amount of fame and a certain amount of fortune, I suppose, not a hell of a lot of fortune, but enough to keep a shot on his back, enough to replace his faithful donkey if that sad occasion arose, and even to buy a few strings for his fiddle. Or, by all accounts, he was partial to another pint of porter. He had that. It gave him that financial independence, and I don't know how. I've been talking too much. He suffered a stroke. The amount of ground he covered was phenomenal, lads. We know that he had pupils as far east as Turin Derby near Newmarket, and west, practically to the shores of Castlemaine Harbour, and all points in between. It was amazing for a blind man and a donkey. And he finished up. He got a soft stroke in Farren 4, and his family brought him in here to back home here to Ballydesmond, and from there over to the Nazareth home in Mallow, and that's where he passed away before he was brought back here and buried, really within an ass's roar of his own home. As the crow flies, less than a mile, about maybe a mile and a half by road. And I don't know how I'm going to what I'd say for a finish up about him, because as I say, I don't know a whole lot of him. I knew his nephews and things like that, and they were all good humoured people, and he would have been a reputation. I don't know when he started teaching, probably as a teenager. Maybe he started off with a few of the neighbours' children and things like that, and eventually spread his wings, and as his fame, as fame as a good humoured and a good teacher spread. And as I say, he had pupils all over the country. Many of them lying here in this graveyard as well as many great musicians that Con hinted at them there before. And I think at this stage I'll shut up and just say that I want you all to join us, and we'll play the Ballydesmond polkas. Tom would have had. We were talking about the hand-down and the influence they had in the future. Tom would have had no inkling at all of how popular Sliabh Luachra music would be, not only in Ireland, but all over the world at this stage. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that there are some bunch of fellas playing the Ballydesmond polkas in Tokyo today, and World Fiddle Day, and all across Asia, and in Russia. We have several friends in Russia who play the music of these hills.
Yeah.
All across Europe and Australia, across the broad Atlantic, from the east coast to the west coast of America and back to the Pacific again. You know, he just wouldn't ever have imagined that it would have come. And as I say, their influence was so important. And we'll play just a couple of tunes now. The Ballydesmond polkas we thought would be appropriate here in Ballydesmond, and in doing so we'll remember Tom and his family and his friends and neighbours, his pupils and all the other musicians, the singers, the composers that are lying here in this graveyard with them. And thanks very much.
Well done, man. Well done.
I'm going to lay this little reed.
Thank you very much, Mary.
I'm joined by another old troubadour here. He's one of the last of the old crowd. Are you
One of the old.
Are you the oldest of the young crowd? Are you the youngest of the old crowd? Will we start at 4? 1, 2, 3, 4.